Hi, my name is Emily Holtzman. I'm a graduating senior at Northwestern University with a major in religious studies, minor in history, and certificate in leadership. My thesis project is entitled Objects of Influence, Sacrality and Native American Material Culture Across 5 Contexts. Before I begin, I would like to recognize that Northwestern University sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. Much of the work of this project also took place in Westfield, New Jersey, which sits on the traditional homelands of the Lenni Lenape. In this project, I present a 5-step framework for studying Native American material culture over time and space. In particular, I seek to study the ways objects are interpreted and reinterpreted in each of these different contexts and how they take on different identities as a result. Much has been written on the politics of representing Native American objects in American museums and on the successes and stumbles associated with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. However, the vast majority of scholarship on Native American material culture focuses on a single context, for example, a museum exhibition. The element of change over time and place is therefore underexplored. Taking a biographical approach, this research follows the journeys of Native American material cultural heritage through a framework of 5 generalized points in the life cycle of such objects. 1, origin, 2, acquisition, 3, exhibition, 4, repatriation, and 5, return. In each stage, objects are acted upon by power, expectation, and cultural values, both indigenous and Euro-American. As objects' meanings are socially constructed and subjective, change in classification and context dramatically affects how an object is perceived, how it is treated, and what it can be. Our case study today is this beaver-shaped prow piece from the Tlingit-Kutznuwu clan of Angoon, Alaska. Angoon is a small island village of about 600 people, and the prow piece began as the prow piece of a canoe. The canoe was a symbol of survival and cooperation for the community, because after bombardment by the US Navy destroyed every other canoe they had, this canoe was used to keep the village alive through the winter of 1882. When the canoe ultimately fell into disrepair and had to be retired, the prow piece was saved and kept within the community in remembrance of the significance of the canoe. The prow piece was eventually acquired by a collector and transferred to the American Museum of Natural History, or the AMNH, in New York City, where it was cataloged as an item from Alaska, but was not specified as being from Angoon. This was especially harmful on the prow piece because its importance stemmed from the canoe's particular relationship with the villagers of Angoon, which was not shared by any other Tlingit community. The act of acquisition separates the object from its origin in 2 ways. First, by physically removing the object from its source community, and second, by cleaving the object from its traditional interpretation grounded in indigenous knowledge and oral tradition. Scholars are right to connect this break in the biography to colonial encounter, as the massive collecting projects of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were closely tied to social Darwinism and federal support for undermining native lifeways and encouraging assimilation. To my knowledge, this object was not ever publicly exhibited at the AMNH. However, in studying exhibition, we can also look to the fact that it was housed at a natural history museum at all. The context of the Natural History Museum is one of great tension. You can perhaps recall from your own experiences that natural history museums do not exhibit European culture or American culture, but they do often have Native American, Asian, Pacific, and African sections. What this means is that objects in the museum, be they human remains, material culture, or sacred objects, become used as tools of white supremacy for the purpose of promoting social Darwinism and harmful stereotypes, such as the idea that Native peoples have vanished or died. Natural history museums are also notable for their longstanding practice of ocular centricism, which focuses on the visitor's exclusively visual experience of the presented objects, as well as object centricism, expecting materials to do the majority of the so-called talking in the exhibit, even when they lack context or appropriate didactic material. In 1990, the United States passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which instituted a federally supported procedure by which Native American tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations could reclaim sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, unassociated funerary objects, and human remains and associated funerary objects that were deemed culturally affiliated with that community. The Kutznuwu prow piece was ultimately repatriated. A stroke of luck led a Tlingit delegation to the AMNH to find the item in a storeroom despite the fact that it had not been marked as from Angoon originally. NAGPRA was a major piece of legislation that resulted from decades of Indigenous activism as part of the American Indian movement. It has led to the successful repatriation of tens of thousands of objects and human remains. However, NAGPRA is not without its flaws. One of the problems faced during repatriation efforts is circumstances in which Euro-American legal definitions regarding Native American religion are inadequate for describing the full extent of Native sacred objects and ceremonial practices. Another problem is that while NAGPRA cites oral traditions and other forms of Native knowledge as legitimate types of evidence which can be used to prove cultural affiliation, Native people have no say in the acceptance of a repatriation claim because decision-making power lies solely with museum administrators. Some have argued that a repatriation claim represents a radical shift in meaning for the claimant, the museum, and the artifact. However, the process of repatriation can take years, and cultural affiliation is always a matter of debate between the museum and the tribe. Therefore, I argue the stage of repatriation is not one epitomizing event, but in fact a lengthy intermediary stage for the object, in which it is acted upon by bureaucratic forces and left in a liminal state in which it is neither exhibited nor returned home. As years pass and research efforts and debates on cultural affiliation and ownership continue, the object waits on the storage room shelf. The circumstances of objects that have been repatriated are as diverse as their origins. In some cases, Native American tribes have been able to resume rituals that were halted for generations. In other cases, new traditions have begun. Upon its return to the village, the prow piece took on a new life. Where it before represented the memory of the canoe to which it was once attached, it now carries its own significance, representing renewal, survivance, and history. Nowadays, the prow piece is a centerpiece at many Tlingit ceremonies and rituals, as shown in these photos, and is one of many repatriated Tlingit objects that have contributed to young Tlingit people's ability to learn about and participate in their culture and rituals. And so although the object has returned to its source community and its source context, it is quite different than when it began. It is clear that the interpretation of objects is not an objective science. Objects' meanings are constructed through social interaction as they come into contact with new people, places, eras, and ideas. I have presented these interactions in a linear manner, following a 5-stage framework of 1, origin, 2, acquisition, 3, exhibition, 4, repatriation, and 5, return. The multiple possible interpretations of an object need not supersede one another over time. Indeed, it is often the persistence of an original interpretation which leads to a repatriation claim on an object held under an exhibited interpretation. At the same time, objects carry the effects of repetitive, radical reinterpretation from one stage to the next. Moreover, the reinterpretation of objects impacts Native Americans today. When objects' ties to their source communities are deliberately severed by collectors and curators, the community members are stripped of connections to their history and sacred lifeways. Repatriation of objects can support the renewal and survivance of Native American ritual life and culture, but not all that has been lost can be regained. Though the subjective nature of objects' meanings has led to inaccurate and offensive interpretations over the centuries, we should not necessarily view such subjectivity as a flaw. Instead, we should take it as an opportunity to recognize how much our own knowledge and positionality shapes our perception of objects in our world. I have endeavored to analyze objects and their biographies to the best of my ability, and at the end of the day, my analysis is simply one more subjective interpretation of objects' meanings. Hopefully by now, viewers of this presentation have developed subjective interpretations of their own. Thank you very much.